If the BC government says about 60 million cubic meters of timber are available every year, but companies can only find about 40 million cubic meters to cut, what does that tell you? It tells you something very simple. BC's timber numbers don't add up. That gap is one of the reasons mills are closing across BC, even though the landscape still looks green in some places. BC's forestry system runs on a number called the Allowable Annual Cut. It's the official amount of timber the province says can be harvested every year. But here's the part almost nobody talks about. There's a reason those numbers stay high, even when the forests can't support them. And that reason has nothing to do with trees. In BC, timber licenses show up on corporate balance sheets as assets worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Once you understand that, a lot of the decisions around timber supply start to make more sense. Today, I want to explain why BC's timber numbers don't add up, and why that gap between official numbers and the real forest is driving the mill closures we're seeing. And the most surprising part is that foresters actually warned about this decades ago. Back in the 1970s, when the province began modeling long-term timber supply, analysts identified something called fall down. Fall down describes the point where harvest levels drop sharply after the original natural forests are cut, and the system has to rely on younger second growth forests that haven't matured yet. In 1980, the chief forester of BC, John Cuthbert, explained this in a film called The Fall Down Effect.
From the second crop, we will be cutting much younger trees. So the volume in the second rotation will be less per acre than from the old stockpile. That old stockpile was a bonus, a gift from nature, but we won't have it the next time around.
What we're seeing today, declining harvest levels, fiber shortages, mill closures, and job losses, is exactly what those fall down models predicted would happen if the system kept pushing volume. And that's where the numbers start to matter. That brings us back to the number that drives the entire system, the Allowable Annual Cut, or AAC, the official harvest level the government says can be cut every year. That number drives planning, investment, and the structure of the industry. But here's the key point. If the AAC is set too high, higher than the real forest can sustain, the system can keep running for a while, but eventually it runs into a wall. And that's what we're seeing now. By the end of 2023, the provincial AAC was around 60 million cubic meters. The actual harvest was closer to 40 million cubic meters. Some people hear that and say, well, if companies aren't even cutting the full AAC, what's the problem? The gap doesn't mean the forest is healthy. It means the model is unrealistic. It means the government is claiming more timber exists than companies can actually find on the ground. You can't cut imaginary timber. And you can't run mills on spreadsheet timber. And that's why many of the mill closures we're seeing are being explained by companies as a lack of economically viable fiber. The numbers say the timber is there, but when companies go looking for it, they can't find enough wood that can actually run a mill profitably. So why doesn't the government just lower the number to match reality? This is where the incentive problem comes in. Because when the AAC is set higher, the system looks healthier on paper. And that matters financially. Forest licenses in BC are permissions to harvest timber on Crown land. But even though these licenses are just permissions granted by the province, they're treated as assets by corporations. On corporate financial statements, BC timber licenses show up as intangible assets alongside mills and equipment. And the numbers are not small. For example, Canfor's financial statements show timber licenses valued at $445 million in 2019 and $323 million in 2024. Interfor shows timber license assets at $158 million in 2024, and West Fraser lists licenses alongside property and equipment with a combined value of $4.2 billion US in its 2024 report. Those values affect how the company looks to banks and lenders, how strong it appears, and how much it can borrow. So now ask yourself, if your business model depends on looking financially strong, what happens when the official government number that underpins your access to timber drops? In simple terms, the government's harvest number, or AAC, directly affects how valuable those licenses appear on corporate balance sheets. And those licenses don't just sit on balance sheets. Companies can sell them, trade them, or transfer them during mergers and acquisitions. So when the official timber supply looks larger, those licenses can appear more valuable, not just for borrowing, but for sale. So higher AAC, a license looks like it gives access to more timber, and the license looks more valuable. A lower AAC, the license looks like it gives access to less timber, and the license value falls. When license value falls, equity falls, or shareholder value falls, and debt to equity ratios get worse. That's something companies and lenders, plus shareholders, don't want. So when people ask, why doesn't the province just lower the AAC to match reality? This is a big part of the answer. Lowering the AAC doesn't just admit ecological limits. It creates a financial problem for the companies holding the licenses, and a political problem for government. And that's why you can end up with inflated assumptions that persist. And when researchers started digging into the numbers, they found something even more troubling. The gap between official and real timber supply can be enormous. A report about the Mackenzie timber supply area was recently leaked. It was written by professionals who did a deep dive into the numbers, and they found that the AAC for the region was based on incorrect and/or inflated numbers. They found that calculations for the AAC counted stands that are too small to harvest economically, counted stands that don't actually exist on the ground, rely on old, inaccurate forest inventories, and assume growth rates that don't match reality. The authors, Watts and Rades, conclude the Mackenzie AAC is likely about twice what the forest can actually sustain. More specifically, the inventory analysis found major overestimation of merchantable timber volume, including a 126% overestimation of live merchantable volume. This is because the modeling relies on overly optimistic assumptions about growth, wildfire, and plantation performance. The authors pointed out that this modeling system is used for all the timber supply areas in BC. So the likelihood of other regional AACs being overestimated is high. When the underlying inventory and growth assumptions are inflated, the AAC or timber supply is inflated. And when the timber supply is inflated, it props up a system where the official story can keep going longer than the actual fiber supply. So the incentive becomes delay correction of the AAC numbers, lobby to keep the number optimistic, and push the cut while you still can. And that doesn't require a conspiracy theory, it's basic incentive structure. And this is why you see the same cycle repeating. Optimistic modeling, inflated AAC, overcutting, depletion, and mill closures blamed on markets, repeat. And it leads to the core point. If the rules reward inflated quotas and protect license values, the system won't self-correct, because self-correction harms the people and institutions with the most influence. So the solution can't just be better policy advice. It has to be structural, which brings us back to the bigger picture. If the current system is built around maintaining the timber volume, what does a system look like if it's built around ecological reality instead? Forests are infrastructure. We usually think of infrastructure as roads, bridges, dams, or water treatment plants. But forests perform essential functions too. They regulate water across the landscape, they stabilize slopes, they keep streams cold, they reduce flood risks and influence fire behavior. When those systems fail, communities pay the price. And when a bridge collapses, we don't say markets are volatile. We say the system failed, the design was wrong, the standards were wrong, the incentives were wrong. BC's forestry system is facing the same kind of structural failure. The numbers say one thing, the forests say another. And until those two things line up again, the problems we're seeing, fiber shortages, mill closures, and declining harvests, are going to keep repeating. Because in the end, you can't run a forestry system on optimistic spreadsheets. You have to run it on real forests. And right now, BC's timber numbers don't add up. Complaining won't fix this. New rules will. If you want a real solution instead of another press release, support the New Forest Act project at boundaryforest.org.